I have joined. Mansi, where is she?
Yes, ma'am.
Please switch on your camera.
Ma'am, I have switched on my camera.
Okay, now it is all right.
Yeah,
You are not visible.
Okay.
Daljit ma'am, can we start?
Yeah, ma'am is there.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just calling. No service dikha raha tha na, so I just called her.
Okay.
She's there already. She is joined. Okay.
Yes. Okay. Mansi, you can start.
Okay, ma'am. So, good morning and a warm welcome to all present here to attend the webinar on the topic Gandhi and India's Peasants, an Intimate Relationship by Professor Mridula Mukherjee. This webinar is the initiative of Gatha, the History Society of Mata Sundari College for Women. I, Mansi Malik, Vice President of Gatha, heartily welcome today's speaker and an eminent historian, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, our dynamic principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur, teacher in charge, Dr. Daljit Kaur, coordinator of the webinar, Dr. Simi Kapoor Mehta, and all other dignitaries and dear participants. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few points so that there is no inconvenience during today's events. Throughout the webinar, all the participants would be muted by the host. The chat will be enabled only in the last 15 minutes of the webinar. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat window. The designated Q&A session would take place towards the end of the webinar. We will address the questions there only. For those who are unable to join through Zoom, you can access this session through the YouTube platform by joining the lecture, which is also being streamed live. Following the webinar, a link for the feedback form will be provided in the chat box. And e-certificates will only be issued to those participants who will fill the form. So make sure that you fill the form. So beginning with today's webinar, I would like to request our teacher in charge, Dr. Daljit Kaur, to share a few words with us. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you, Mansi. Thank you, Mansi. I think, ma'am, this will be now the formal welcome to you. So we very warm welcome to you from all of us at Mata Sundari College, from our faculty member, and ma'am is there. Principal ma'am is there, so she's also there. First of all, I would like to just few words, because as you already know that students, they have interacted with you, and I'm very happy for that. You gave your that valuable and precious time to my dear students. They were very much excited about that. And secondly, I have gone through, though I missed that interaction, but I found them full of everything. You guided them with the simplicity, with your time, your everything. Now they're the brand and everything. You connected them with the your times. I will say your time, our time, and now their time. So you were connecting them, these generations, all together. So thanks again, ma'am. Especially thanks to Simi for organizing like this. And I think this, my students, they are very happy after interactions with you, and so do I. So once again, very warm welcome from all of us faculty members on behalf of my Department of History. Again, I very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your kind words. I would now like to request our principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur, to kindly enlighten us with her encouraging words.
Good morning.
Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, good morning. On behalf of Gatha, the History Society, I accord a very, very warm welcome to Professor Mridula Mukherjee, Professor of Modern Indian History at JNU. And she has spared her valuable time. I'm very thankful to you ma'am, and also Gatha President Ananya, Coordinator Dr. Simi Mehta of this event, Teacher in Charge Dr. Daljit Kaur, and all the participants. You have joined on this very, very interesting topic and very, very pertinent topic for today, because India, of course, the topic is India and Gandhi, Gandhi and India's peasants, of course, that intimate relationship. But I understand this topic is much more relevant because we all are seeing the stalemate between the peasants and the government. Despite all apprehensions, I think the major thing is that we have to find a solution to it. And everybody agrees on this issue that this stalemate should really end very soon and there should be a solution. So in this background, if we are sensitizing the students about the peasants during the national struggle, I think that is where becomes very relevant. Then the history students actually can sketch the historical perspective, and they can understand that what has been the role of peasants right from beginning, and how peasants have been very, very important for us because India basically is an agricultural country, and till date also nearing 70%, less than 70% are dependent on it. But the thing is that this number is lessening. But why this number is lessening and so on, all these things are modern problems which have to be understood in light of the historical perspective. About the Indian national freedom struggle and discontentment in the peasants. I think that discontentment in the peasants was there in the medieval times also because of the zamindari system and all those exploitative economic system which was there. And this continued, and with the advent of Britishers, this problem even aggravated because their own policies were also into it, and more and more exploitation perpetrated on the peasants. And that is why this resistant movement of peasants has been a part and parcel. And because the peasants are so haphazard, they are so distributed all through the country, and also that they do not have financial resources to gear up. Their movement has always been very, very slackened. It's not been so powerful because of various reasons. But Gandhi's opinion and this amalgam of the peasants into the Indian national struggle was a contribution which resulted not only in lot many, you can say, a lot many changes, positive changes which came as far as the law is concerned. For example, abolition of zamindari system was the result of this kind of inclusion of peasants into the national struggle and so on. So these are the lasting contributions. But Gandhi's peasant movement, whether it is a Jambaran Satyagraha, where the cultivation of indigo was a basic problem there, and where the shift was there, and the indigo planters were really facing a lot of problems. And so this movement was launched by Gandhi there only, and this helped this rent payment, what was payable by the peasants to the planters, that kind of a problem was solved to large extent. And even Khedda Satyagraha, there also this revenue remission in 1918, that problem was there, and that is why the peasants were revolting, and Gandhi gave support to their just demand. And similarly in Bardoli Satyagraha also, and all these, I think ma'am will sketch out the whole historical perspective. But during the non-cooperation movement, Kisan Sabhas were organized, and these Kisan Sabhas which were organized, that is, mobilization of peasants was there, and numbers were there with the peasants. And in the whole, whether we see all the marches, whether it is Dandi March and all other marches by Mahatma Gandhi, the multitude of populace came and joined, whether it is men or women. They came and joined that particular march. And in this, the role of peasants was also there, and they also joined. So in civil disobedience movement, atmosphere was created where a lot of kisans and lot of farmers were a part of the civil disobedience movement, and of course they had their own agenda. But at the same time, it is important that they participated in the Indian freedom struggle in their own ways. So their contribution has not much been studied. So a lot of studies can be done in that vein. And these are all, so Gandhi's opinion about this whole population, this neglected section, and also giving rights to them and justice to them, has been major premise. That's why we can say that it is important that the history students know about this background and this role of peasants and Gandhi, and that kind of a relationship between them, and also that Gram Sabha and Gram Swaraj, which Gandhi envisioned. It's all because again the population resided in the villages. So at this juncture, when the farmers are sitting on the borders and they are really facing quite a lot of problem, it is important that we understand their plight, and also in the light of history, and then try to empathize with them if we cannot do anything else. We all really believe and really aspire that this problem should be solved very soon. And so with these words, once again, I will welcome Professor Mridula and thank her for joining us. And also Dr. Daljit, who has been always active and doing various activities from time to time. Dr. Simi also, and the entire history department. And also the students who have been so active, whether it is contacting Professor Mridula or other activities, conducting the program. And basically these activities are for your benefit. So have a very insightful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for such valuable information and your encouraging words. Next, I would like to call upon the coordinator of the webinar, Dr. Simi Kapoor Mehta, to give a concept note. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mansi. On behalf of the Department of History of Mata Sundari College for Women, I extend a warm welcome to our esteemed guest, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, our dear Principal Professor Harpreet Kaur, friends from the teaching fraternity, and dear students. It is a momentous occasion that we have Professor Mukherjee here with us today, who will be speaking on Gandhi and India's peasants, an intimate relationship. The name of Gandhi still arouses a lot of interest and emotion amongst the people around the world. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was an ordinary-looking Indian with an extraordinary multifaceted personality. He was the foremost leader of the mass appeal, who shaped the Indian national movement into a mass movement. Gandhi's own life and his journey of experimenting with the truth has always been a motivation to the people across the globe. His life, style, thought, action, philosophy, and movements have always provided inspiration, not only to the common man, but also to other leaders, humanitarians, educationists, activists, and of course, the literary people. Like a Pied Piper, with ahimsa and satyagraha as his symbolic flute, he charmed the Indians on the path of the independence through his three very important movements: the non-cooperation, the civil disobedience, and the Quit India movement. He was always effortless towards bringing different communities of India together. Gandhi, his thought and movement became a theme of great literary and artworks. Even writers like Premchand did not remain unaffected. I will quote something. It is quoted from Dr. Ashok Kumar Rawat's book on Premchand called Premchand Ghar Mein. And this book is actually a unique book written by his wife, which is quoted by Dr. Ashok Kumar. And I will just quote two lines of that conversation between the husband and wife, that is Shivrani Devi and Premchand. Shivrani Devi says, "तो आप भी क्या महात्मा के तरफदार हो गए हैं?" And Premchand replies, "अरे तरफदार होने को तुम कहती हो, मैं उनका चेला हो गया। चेला तो उसी समय हुआ जब वे गोरखपुर आए थे। Even there are many other such examples. Another is that, in fact, in 1920, Gandhi gave a direction to Congress at Nagpur that, quote, the object of the Congress is to is the attainment of Swaraj by the people of India by all legitimate and peaceful means, unquote. This simple appeal not only affected a whole lot of Indians across the country, but even the hardy Pakhtuns or the Pathans of Northwest Rangi province. Abdul Ghaffar Khan, whom we known as, who's also known as Frontier Gandhi, was inspired by Gandhi and led his people on the path of ahimsa, constructive programs. And we all know about, and I'm sure none of us can forget about the Kissa Kahani Bazaar episode, and when the Garhwal regiment soldiers refused to fire on the unarmed non-violent Pathans. So there are numerous such examples which tell us about how perceived Gandhi and followed him. After his return from South Africa, Gandhi did travel across India to understand real rural India and Indians. And later in December 1916, his meeting with Rajkumar Shukla from Jambaran led him to those issues which were ruining the impoverished peasants. Jambaran, Khera, and the list is long. If we go on, it is endless. But we come to a question now. How did a common man, a poor farmer, relate to Gandhi? I'm sure nobody can tell us that better than our guest who has researched on India's peasants in detail. Without taking any more time, I will ask Gatha President Ananya to brief our guests and especially our students about Professor Mukherjee, who is an institution in herself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. I'm immensely overjoyed to take this opportunity to introduce our guest speaker of the session, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, who is an inspiration to the whole student and teaching fraternity. Her works and her personality speaks for herself, but I'll still try to summarize her great and insightful journey through my words. Some of our third-year students got the opportunity to have a light-hearted conversation with her. So with her due permission, I will add some of the excerpts from it. Born and brought up in Delhi, Professor Mridula Mukherjee completed her bachelor's in history from Lady Shri Ram College, University of Delhi. She completed her master's from University of Delhi and joined the Jawaharlal Nehru University as a student in 1971, from where she obtained a MPhil and a PhD degree. She was one among those pioneering teachers who gave JNU the name it has today. Professor Mukherjee recently retired from the Center for Historical Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, after teaching there for over 4 decades. She was a chairperson of the center as well. Professor Mukherjee was appointed as the director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2006 to 2011. She has presided over the Indian History Congress as well. She was also appointed as the Dean of School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Mridula Mukherjee has penned many exemplary books, articles, and monographs, etc. And I'm sure she'll continue to do so in the future. Some of her excellent published works are Peasants in India's Nonviolent Revolution, Practice and Theory, Peasants in India's Nonviolent Revolution Part 2, Interrogating Peasant Historiography, Peasant Perspectives, Marxist Practice, and Subaltern Theory. Colonizing Agriculture, The Myth of Punjab Exceptionalism. Her other works in which she was the co-author includes India's Struggle for Independence, India Since Independence, RSS School Text and the Murder of Mahatma Gandhi, The Hindu Communal Project. She is one of the editors of the Sage series of modern Indian history and some of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru. She specializes in agrarian history, Peasants Movement, Indian National Movement, and Mahatma Gandhi. Apart from spreading her knowledge and wisdom among Indian students, she has also enlightened the students of foreign universities. She has been a visiting scholar and a fellow at several universities, including the Duke University at USA, Institute of Oriental Culture, University of Tokyo, Institutes for Advanced Study, France, University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, La Sapienza University of Rome. Professor Mukherjee has been very vocal about her thoughts and has always been a source of motivation to the younger generation. Being a teacher in her early 20s, Professor Mukherjee believes that once a teacher, always a teacher, and she loves having healthy debates, discussions, giving advice, and accepting constructive changes as well. She has been regularly invited for talks, lectures, seminars, and discussions on radio and TV. Having such a great personality with us is an honor for all. Thank you so much, ma'am, for sparing time for us.
Thank you, Ananya. We are thrilled to have you, ma'am. Thank you for joining us today. Kindly grace us with your words.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. I will not take everybody's name, but thank you very much to the principal, head of department, teacher in charge, seminar convener, all the girls who have been interacting with me now for the second time. I enjoyed my interaction with you a couple of days ago. And thank you so much, Mata Sundari College, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to get to know all of you, to especially the younger generations. I think one of the things, as you said, I always love about teaching is that you are in touch with young people, and that keeps you young. You are never cut off from the life, because every year in your class a new batch is coming, and it's a younger batch is bringing their own, concerns, their own excitement, all the things which they are reacting to in society, they're bringing that into your classroom and into your life. So I'm really happy for this opportunity that you've given me to interact with all of you. Thank you, all of you, for the very generous introduction that you've given me. And thank you also to the teachers for the introduction to the subject, which has naturally made my task a little easier. You have already introduced some of the ideas relating to Gandhi and peasants, relationship between the freedom struggle, the struggles of the peasants, all those things you have already mentioned in your introduction. So I will now proceed with what I have to say to you. It's a difficult thing to talk about Gandhi and peasants, because for the very simple reason that there's just so much that one can say, and to try to even encapsulate that relationship, which aspect do you take up, what do you leave out, what do you include? Even if one was to just do a narrative story of the different movements, it would still be a very long story, Gandhi and involvement with the peasants' relationship with him, the peasants' understanding of Gandhi, as your ma'am said, why and how did they react to him. There is just so much. So it is for me, and I've been thinking about this lecture, a very difficult job to actually try and put it all together in a lecture, and try to do justice. But I will try my best. I will try to highlight what I think are some of the very important aspects of this problem. And where do I begin? Where do I end? I don't know. But I thought a good beginning could be, I will begin with a quote from Jawaharlal Nehru. For the very simple reason that, just as your ma'am just now had quoted Premchand's reaction to his wife's question, Premchand is obviously a great person. And when we are trying to understand other great persons, we often look to other great persons, see how they understood them, right? So, and it is my understanding that one of the people who understood Gandhiji the best, not only worked with him, not only was one his chief lieutenant, not only was his heir, but he had a very deep, complex, subtle, critical, but sympathetic understanding of Gandhiji. So I will begin with that, and then we'll go on to the rest of the story. So I'm beginning with this quotation from The Discovery of India, which to my mind is one of the most brilliant passages of prose also. Nehru is talking about the advent of Gandhi onto the Indian scene. He describes the situation before Gandhi came as one where, in a sense, politics was in a stalemate. People didn't know what to do. Many things were happening. People were discontented, but there was a passivity. There was exploitation, there was oppression, there was political suppression, but there was an inability to get out of it. He said there were only two alternatives. One was those who took the path of revolutionary terrorism, and the others were those who, petitioned and held meetings and argued and all. But the action part is what he says was missing. And then he describes the advent of Gandhi onto the scene and what difference it made. And I will just quote to you his very poetic words. And then Gandhi came, says Nehru. He was like a powerful current of fresh air that made us stretch ourselves and take deep breaths, like a beam of light that pierced the darkness and removed the scales from our eyes, like a whirlwind that upset many things, but most of all, the working of people's minds. He did not descend from the top. He seemed to emerge from the millions of India, speaking their language and incessantly drawing attention to them and their appalling condition. Do note this line, huh? Gandhi does not descend from the top. He seemed to emerge from the millions of India. Who are these millions? They're obviously the peasants. Get off the backs of these peasants and workers, he told us, all you who live by their exploitation. Get rid of the system that produces this poverty and misery. Political freedom took new shape then and acquired a new content. The essence of his teaching was fearlessness and truth, and action allied to these, always keeping the welfare of the masses in view. But the dominant impulse in India under British rule, Nehru says, was that of fear. Pervasive, oppressing, strangling fear. Fear of the army, the police, the widespread secret service. Fear of the official class. Fear of laws meant to suppress and of prison. Fear of the landlord's agent. Fear of the moneylender. Fear of unemployment and starvation, which were always on the threshold. It was against this all-pervading fear that Gandhi's quiet and determined voice was raised. And what did that voice say? Be not afraid. This is how Nehru encapsulates the effect that Gandhi had on the people of India. He also then tells us how when Gandhiji for the first time entered the Congress organization, what happened. He says, Gandhi for the first time entered the Congress organization and immediately brought about a complete change in its constitution. He made it democratic and a mass organization. Democratic, it had been previously also, but it had so far been limited in franchise and restricted to the upper classes. Now the peasants rolled in. Here we come to the peasants. Now the peasants rolled in, and in its new garb, it began to assume the look of a vast agrarian organization with a strong sprinkling of the middle classes. This agrarian character was to grow. This is what Nehru tells us. He also then says, what was his idea of India, which we were setting out to mold according to his own wishes and ideals? And then he quotes Gandhi. I shall work for an India in which the poorest shall feel that it is their country, in whose making they have an effective voice, an India in which there shall be no high class and low class of people, an India in which all communities shall live in perfect harmony. There can be room in such an India for the curse of untouchability or the curse of intoxicating drinks and drugs. Women will enjoy the same rights as men. This is the India of my dreams, unquote. Again, Nehru says, what was Nehru's relationship with the with Hinduism, with Hindu inheritance? And again, he said he refused to narrow his cultural inheritance, even though he was a proud Hindu. Indian culture, he wrote, he quotes Gandhi. Indian culture is neither Hindu, Islamic, nor any other wholly. It is a fusion of all. This is Gandhi, not Nehru. And he said, I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible. But I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. I refuse to live in other people's houses as an interloper, a beggar, or a slave. And Nehru concludes, influenced by modern thought currents, he never let go of his roots and clung to them tenaciously. This is the last quotation that I will give you from Nehru, because again, I think it communicates something very, very important. He says about Gandhi, he says, in his single track and yet many-sided nature, the dominant impression that one gathered was his identification with the masses, a community of spirit with them, an amazing sense of unity with the dispossessed and poverty-stricken, not only of India, but of the world. Even religion, as everything else, took second place to his passion to raise these submerged people. He quotes Gandhi, a semi-starved nation can have neither religion, nor art, nor organization. Whatever can be useful to starving millions is beautiful to my mind. Let us give today first the vital things of life, and all the graces and ornaments of life will follow. I want art and literature that can speak to millions. These unhappy, dispossessed millions haunted him, and everything seemed to revolve around them. For millions, it is an eternal vigil or an internal trance. His ambition, he said, Gandhi said, was to wipe every tear from every eye. I quoted this at length to get you a sense, a feeling, an emotion about what we are talking about. It is not just a bare, analytical description of an historical phenomenon. No, there is poetry in it. There is passion in it. There is emotion in it. To answer the question, why did peasants respond to him? Why did he relate with them? You need to go beyond just bald prose. You need the Premchand. You need Nehru, who understood and who could express that feeling in this kind of a powerful way. It is not just enough to read the dry government files and come to conclusions about historical events. Historians need to go to literature. Historians need to go to oral sources. Historians need to go and find out what people actually think and how they articulate their thoughts, how they express those emotions. And that is what I was trying to bring to you, because my time is short. And I thought Nehru was one of the best ways in which I could bring that aspect before you. Gandhiji himself made it very clear that for him, his prime motivation for political work was to improve the lives of the poorest and the dispossessed. And let us be very clear, when in India we talk about the poor, we talk about the dispossessed, where we talk about what Gandhiji called the dumb millions, was a phrase he often used. Who did he mean? It was primarily the peasants of India that he meant, because they were the majority who constituted the majority of the people of India, and especially the majority of the poor and the oppressed. Before again I go into the narrative and the details about this relationship, I want to quote to you a speech, a very important speech, which Gandhiji made at the first roundtable conference in London in 1931, September. You know that after the civil disobedience movement first phase ended in the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, as part of the Gandhi-Irwin Pact, as part of the settlement, the Congress agreed to participate in the roundtable conference in London, which was supposed to discuss the future constitutional development of India. And then the Congress nominated Gandhiji to be the sole representative of the Congress. And Gandhiji went to London. By the way, this was the one and only trip that he made outside India after he came back from South Africa in 1915. Quite remarkable. He never went out of India anywhere. Even on this trip, he had so many invitations. He was supposed to go to the US. He almost agreed, but he never went. He was always too busy. Even this, he went with great difficulty. He almost at the last minute didn't make it. And this, he had to be put on special trains, and trains had to be stopped, and all kinds of things had to be done to get him to the ship, which was sailing from Bombay in time to make him reach there in time for the roundtable conference. So at the first speech which he makes in the roundtable conference, he tells the people over there, and these are, mind you, all the high and mighty of Britain, you know, the cabinet ministers and members of parliament and all the Indian representatives who have gone there, representing princes, representing industry, representing Hindus, Muslims, you know, all this galaxy of people who are there. Dr. Ambedkar. So there, this is his first speech which he's making over there, where he tells them, what does the Congress represent? Where he's really saying, who are we? Who am I? Who am I representing over here? What do I want to talk about here? And I'm going to quote to you a little portion of from here. First of all, he tells them how Congress is a very representative body and represents the different communities and in India, etc., etc., etc. But I'm not going to go into that. I don't have the time. Then he comes to this. He says, above all, the Congress represents in its essence the dumb, semi-starved millions scattered over the length and breadth of the land in its 700,000 villages. Who are these? The peasants. No matter whether they come from what is called British India or what is called Indian India. Every interest which, in the opinion of the Congress, is worthy of protection has to subserve the interests of these dumb millions. And so you do find now and again, apparently, a clash between several interests. But if there is a genuine, real clash, I have no hesitation in saying on behalf of the Congress that the Congress will sacrifice every interest for the sake of the interests of these dumb millions. It is therefore essentially a peasant organization, and it is becoming so progressively. I'm repeating this sentence. What is Gandhiji saying about the Congress? It is therefore essentially a peasant organization, and it is becoming so progressively. You will, even the Indian members of the committee, perhaps be astonished to find that today the Congress, through its organization, the All India Spinners Association, is finding work for nearly 50,000 women in nearly 2,000 villages. And these women are possibly 50% Musalman women. Thousands of them belong to the so-called untouchable class. We have thus, in this constructive manner, penetrated these villages. An effort is being made to cover every one of the 700,000 villages. It is a superhuman task, but if human effort can do so, you will presently find the Congress covering all of these villages and bringing to them the message of the spinning wheel. So see the kind of emphasis that he puts on Congress being a representative of the peasants in the highest forums that he could possibly be addressing. It is not only when he's talking to peasants that he's talking about their problems. He's forefronting the problems of the peasants in the highest councils where it really matters. In fact, during this visit to England, where he stayed for about almost 3 months, because the roundtable conference went on and on and on. He is constantly, if you just study, look at that particular volume of the collected works and just go through the speeches which he makes at different forums, and he speaks in all kinds of forums. He speaks to workers in Lancashire, he speaks to clergymen, he speaks to members of parliament, he speaks to opposition MPs, he speaks to Americans. I mean, it's amazing the kind of variety of audiences which he's addressing during this brief visit to England. In almost every speech, he's constantly saying that, the real problems in India are the problems of poverty, of exploitation, what British rule has done to us. In Lancashire, for example, they take him there and they think that, they will show him the poverty of the worker who has been rendered unemployed by the boycott movement in India, the boycott of foreign cloth movement in India, affected the cotton textile industry in Lancashire. So the Lancashire people took him there to impress upon him that, your policies of economic boycott are leading to the poverty of the workers here. So he went there, he met the workers, he talked to them, he talked to their leaders, he talked to the workers. And he then told them, he said, while I fully sympathize with you, and I agree that the difficulties which you have been placed in are serious, and I'm very sorry. But he said, you must understand, my primary responsibility is to the peasants of India. And he said, you have no idea what you are talking about poverty. Is the standard of living is of a middle class person in India. You have not seen the huts of my poor. When I see your poverty, he describes to them, he was living in the East End of London. East End is where the poorer part of London. And there he was staying in a welfare workers' house, like a community house, He didn't live in the hotels where everybody else was living in the fancy part of London. Even in London, he stayed in the poor person's colony. It's like coming to Delhi and staying in some part of East Delhi or some part of, North Delhi where you don't have all those kind of fancy things. And he said, every morning I go for a walk and I'm in the working class part of London. And I see that there is a bottle of milk on the step outside. I peep in and I even see a stretch of carpet. Sometimes I look through the window and I see a piano. He said, I agree standards of living are different. But even then, he said, you have no idea of the poverty that I'm talking about. You have to come and see the standard of living. And therefore, my commitment to the people of India, to the peasants of India, whose poverty is a result of this whole exploitative system of which you people are a part, I have to end that. And that is my primary concern. So I think more than anything that I want to convey to you is all his involvement, the various movements which he led, all come from this identification which he had. This deep concern, this commitment, this total identification with the poor. I don't have time to go into the South Africa story, but it came to him from there. After all, who were the Indians in South Africa that he was fighting for? There's a small class of merchants over there, hardly any middle class, proper middle class. And then it is the indentured labor. The majority of the Indians, vast majority of the Indians for whose rights he was fighting in South Africa for 20 long years are indentured labor. Who are indentured labor? What do? Most of them were working on farms. They were peasants from India who had gone there and they were working on mostly sugar plantations. Some of them were from South India and some of them were from East India. A lot of them from Tamil Nadu. And there were some people who were working in the mines. So these are the poorest of the poor Indians who he identifies with from word go. It is their movements which he leads in South Africa. So you must understand Gandhi as a representative. It's not representative in a formal sense, you know. You are elected, you stand for election. Representative in the sense of in his being. The way in which he identified in his dress, you know how he came to adopt that dress. He adopted Indian dress even before he came to India. He had given up wearing Western dress, and when he came to India already, he was dressed like a Gujarati peasant. But during the non-cooperation movement, it was on a visit to South India, to Madurai, in fact, that area, where somebody asked him some question, you know, and how much cloth cost and this and that. And he realized that, you know, people couldn't even afford full set of clothes. And that's when he decided that he was going to wear the minimum that was required to cover your body. And he adopted the half dhoti as his mode of dress. And in winter, he wore a shawl, including in England. And you know the famous story when he went to meet royalty, the king. It was during this roundtable conference, and the press reporters asked him that, you know, you went to meet the king wearing this kind of clothes, you know. And he said, don't worry, the king was wearing enough for two of us. So he also had a terrific sense of humor. You know, and so it was not he who looked ridiculous, it was others who wore too many clothes who began to look ridiculous in front of him. That's what he did. He upturned all the imagery. The rich began to look ridiculous. In India, those with titles, sirs and khansabs, began to look ridiculous. Those who were respected began to look ridiculous. Those who wore a dhoti, half dhoti, began to look the ones who were the, you know, people to be respected in society. Jail goers began to be respected. Those who had nothing, gave up everything, they began to be respected and not the richest in the land. That was the capacity of Gandhi. That's how he made the whole country identify with the poor. Okay. Now, let me also go back and talk about some of the important parts of the narrative, important movements, to be able to highlight some of the relationship. Again, I cannot possibly do a full narrative of the peasant struggles with which Gandhiji was connected, both during the course of the freedom struggle as well as those which were outside the formal battles of the freedom struggle. But still, I will highlight some of them in order to give you an idea of the range of his involvement. So beginning, of course, in India, of course, as I said, and I gave you a bit of South Africa, but beginning, of course, with Champaran, you know, which already I think your principal mentioned. What I want to emphasize about Champaran is something a little different. You know, what is the Champaran movement? You read any account of the Champaran movement. What actually happened in it? Normally in a movement, you mobilize the people. They either, you organize big rallies, you organize a no rent movement, a no tax movement, you organize a boycott movement, right? You get people together and you have huge demonstrations, protesting, you do a ghirao, whatever. Now, what happened in Champaran? What did Gandhiji do? What was the movement? What was the content of the movement in Champaran? And there's no doubt that it was a great movement. Gandhiji was called to Champaran, as was mentioned, by a local peasant called Rajkumar Shukla, who chased him all over India till Gandhiji agreed to go to Champaran. The problem in Champaran was that there were these indigo planters who were European in origin. And they had imposed a system for many years on the peasantry, whereby the peasants had to set aside, it was called the tin kathiya system. 3/20 of the land of the peasant had to be set aside for indigo plantation. Okay. And that indigo had to be sold to the planter at a certain price, which was fixed by the planter. And it was a forcible system. Like, even if the peasant wanted to get out of it, he was not allowed to. So there was a coercive element to it. It was not a voluntary choice of the peasants. And as indigo in the international market, indigo prices had been falling, etc., because chemical dyes had come up. What had happened was that the prices that the peasants were paid for this kept on falling, and it became very difficult for them to continue with this cultivation. But they could not get out of it because they didn't have the freedom. These European planters forced them. So that was the big issue. Now, of course, along with it, there was exploitation, oppression, domination, forcible this, that, and the other, forcible recoveries, So what did Gandhiji do? He gave a call for young people to come and join him on this. And a few students of Patna University, including Rajendra Prasad, Brij Kishore Prasad, few, Acharya Kripalani, who later became known as Acharya Kripalani, who was then also a young lecturer in Muzaffarpur College. They joined him, just a few. And they went to Champaran. And Gandhiji said, we have to do what is called a research survey. Action research, it's called nowadays by NGOs. We have to essentially go out and meet the peasants in large numbers and write down their testimony. What is the system? What are they suffering? What prices do they get? What exactly happens? And what they did was they spread out into the villages, he and his team, and they recorded the testimony of 8,000 tenants, indigo tenants. Now, for the first time, there was this data on what the actual system was, what the exploitation was, what actually the peasants were suffering. He collected all this data, and information, as you know, is power. And once he had this data with him, he said to the government, he said, this system is bad, it must go. This is what it's all about. The government initially, instead of listening to him or giving him a hearing, said, you are an outsider. How dare you come here to instigate the peasants over here? You leave because you're an outsider. So he said, in my country, you are the insider and I'm the outsider. The British government can tell me that I'm an outsider in my country. I cannot represent my own people. I refuse to leave. You can do what you like with me. I cannot obey such an order, which tells me that I'm an outsider in my own country. It's as simple as that. So he said, all right, I will not go. It is an act of civil disobedience, right? To disobey an order, to disobey a legal order, a law, is an act of civil disobedience. Up till now, other leaders had also been served such orders, including the great Lokmanya Tilak, had been stopped from going to Punjab in 1907 or 8. He went back. It had not occurred to people that you would sit there and you would say, I'm not leaving. I will not obey an unjust order. It was a new form of struggle. So the government didn't know what to do with him. So they actually picked him up and they put him into jail. So that's all they knew to do with someone who had a huge crowd collected in the Champaran district headquarters for an unknown man, because he was fighting for them. What had he done? He had not mobilized the peasant. He had not told them you have to fight. He had only collected data. But they knew this man has come, and with him people have come in order to address our problems. So they immediately, a huge crowd collected over there. And ultimately, the higher officials realized that they had done something stupid. They had created a turmoil where there was no need to. So the commissioner and the higher authorities then immediately gave orders and said, you release him. And they decided to appoint a committee to go into the whole system, an inquiry committee on which Gandhi was made a member. And this inquiry committee, within a year or 2 years or whatever it was, came out with a report which essentially abolished the system of Tinkatya. End of indigos. But please recall the story I have just told you. No tax, no rent, no boycott, no great demonstrations, nothing, only that one protest when Gandhi was arrested. But this was a movement. Movements are of all kinds. The only civil disobedience was offered by Gandhi himself. Okay? You must understand, in your head, create space. Don't always think you pick up a stone and throw it, it becomes a movement. Violence is not necessary for a movement. Even non-violent mass action is not necessary for every movement. Gandhi did the civil disobedience in this, right? People came out in the support. It became obvious that there is support for this movement. This is your Jambaran movement, right? From here, he went to Kheda. Kheda is a district in Gujarat. Champaran is in Bihar, North Bihar, right on the border with Nepal. Next year, it was Kheda. Now, what was unique about Kheda? Why do I want to talk about Kheda? Because he takes up a completely different issue over here. He takes up the issue of what kind of right does the government have to levy land revenue on the people? What is the law? The law said, if there is a drought, or if there is some other act of nature or whatever, and the crop production, the harvest, falls to less than 25% of the normal. Normal is on the basis of which the tax has been fixed. It's an assumption, you will get this much harvest, you will pay this much tax, right? But if my income falls to less than 25%, the law of the land revenue law said government should give a remission. They should say, we will waive your tax. Now that was the situation. In Kheda, because of drought or whatever, the crops had withered. They were less than 25%. So Gandhi goes there, Patel comes in here. Sardar Patel joins for the first time. Sardar Patel was a barrister practicing in Ahmedabad. He was a good middle class, also London educated barrister who used to spend his time in the club in the evening playing cards, like any successful barrister, who responded to Gandhi's call and gave up that life. And that was the beginning of his jumping into the freedom struggle. So Patel came there with him, and he and others, of course, then they organized the peasants. They went from village to village, talking to people, explaining to them, this is the law. It is your right to refuse land revenue if the production has gone below this. It is your right. So they were teaching them about rights and telling them that you can refuse. You must assert your rights. And that's what that movement was about. So successfully, they mobilized a large number of peasants to actually refuse to pay. Now, what is significant about both these movements is the political context in which they are happening. What are the years? 1917, 1918. What is happening at this time in the world? What is happening? First World War.
World War, yes, ma'am.
So this is the period of the First World War. And First World War, Britain is a party to the First World War. You know that India, they recruited millions from India to go and fight in the First World War,
Yes,
right? And what was the condition in India? Political condition. During war, governments are very reluctant to allow any political activity to happen, right? So these movements, organizing them during the period of First World War was again something very significant. It was though they were taking up economic issues, but they were still with political consequences. So obviously, governments would not be happy with such activities, especially in the time of the First World War. As you know, during Second World War, when Quit India movement was launched, I'll come to that, how brutally they repressed that movement in the name of the war, saying our war effort will be hurt. Annie Besant in 1917 was arrested. Annie Besant, as the leader of the Home Rule League movement, when she became a little too militant for the British, she was arrested in 1917. And then Gandhiji had organized a huge protest. He was part of the huge protest against her. And that is the year that Congress elected her as president of the Indian National Congress in order to show their support for her. So this was a period of repression. It was not a period in which there was free political activity. Okay, you understand? Civil liberties were curbed. So the importance, what I'm trying to explain to you is, when you are studying a movement, whether it's a movement of the peasants or whatever, you have to take the whole context. So when Gandhiji is leading a peasant movement, whether it is Champaran, whether it is Khera, it's also the total context of doing it in the middle of the First World War, when freedom and civil liberties are curbed. So it's a way of defiance, okay, which goes beyond just the immediate issues of the peasants. Each movement, even when a movement does not have a direct political end, is still deeply political. Because political is about what it does to people's consciousness. Political is not about elections. Political is not only about a direct, some settlement or some, struggle happening. Political is about what the process does to the minds of people, how it makes them think, how it changes their way of thinking, how it changes their relationships. What does Champaran do? Champaran changes the nature of class relationships in the countryside, right? The relationship between the cultivator, the tenant, and the European planter, not just a zamindar, local zamindar, a European planter who is supposed to be supported by the state. It changed. It's a completely revolutionary process of politics. Okay. Similarly, then we then of course come to the period of the non-cooperation movement, where I think already reference was made to the Kisan Sabhas that were formed during this period. There was an autonomous Kisan Sabha movement, I think it's important to remember, which was going on at this time in UP. I'm talking about different sectors of the non-cooperation movement. Non-cooperation movement, I'm not going to go into details. You know the broad picture, why it was launched, etc., etc. Before that, there had been the Jallianwala Bagh incident, and all those other things that happened. So in non-cooperation movement, why is it important? For the first time at an all-India level, this movement involves the peasants. It is not only a question of the Kisan Sabha movement in UP or the specific no tax campaign which took place in Guntur, certain places the peasantry came out with certain specific peasant demands and specific separate kind of peasant struggles. That is one part of the non-cooperation movement. Mopla rebellion, for example, is also part of the non-cooperation Khilafat movement. But I'm talking beyond that. Even in those areas where you don't have a separate peasant movement, which you can identify and say this is a peasant movement, or a Kisan Sabha movement, or a Mopla struggle, or a Guntur, a Chirala Pirala struggle, you had the peasantry at large participating in the non-cooperation movement. Right? Now, what was the non-cooperation movement? There was boycott of schools, boycott of colleges, boycott of foreign cloth, promotion of khadi, struggle against untouchability, struggle for Hindu-Muslim unity, charkha. There are various aspects to the non-cooperation movement. We must not also forget that peasants are also citizens. They don't have only peasant demands. They are also Indians. They are also reacting to the situation like any other Indian would. not only for their own specific demands or their specific needs, right? This is something very important to understand. When the peasant understands also there's an additional thing of the freedom struggle explaining to the peasants in India the deep connection between their poverty, their exploitation, their bad economic condition, and the existence of British rule, right? Right from the days of Dadabhai Naoroji and the concept of the drain of wealth, the Indian freedom struggle had been spreading this message that there is a deep connection between the poverty of the peasant and the overall exploitation of India by the British. It is from the peasants' revenues that tax is collected, from the peasant income that the tax is collected, primarily, that ultimately becomes the drain of wealth, which is taken away by to Britain, right? So this deep connection between the poverty of the peasant, between the land revenue system and indebtedness. What were the main problems of the peasant? High land revenue, high land rents, and indebtedness. The economic problems, these were the fundamental problems the peasants faced from. All these were connected to the nature of colonial rule. So they began to understand that the freedom struggle, the broad struggle for freedom, was for them an essential part of their struggle for a better life. There was a deep connection between the two. It was not that economic issues were in one basket and political issues were in another basket. The economic and the political were deeply connected. That's what the message, the understanding that was developed by the Congress and the national movement, and which was spread among the peasants. There's a very interesting report done by the India delegation, which came, which was a group sent by a very important group of people in England, who sent this team, which went into all different parts of India, especially into the rural areas, interviewed hundreds and thousands of peasants. This is 1932. It's called the India League delegation. And they recorded the testimonies of peasants as to how they understood what they were doing. And the report which they gave said that we were amazed at how clearly the peasants, ordinary peasants, understood the connection between their condition and Swaraj, between what was wrong with their lives and the necessity for political independence. They said it was not that they were doing what they were joining out of emotion or out of charisma or out of some blind loyalty or because of some religious, impact of Gandhi or whatever it was, the kind of thing we are sometimes told. It was because they understood the connection between the two. So I think that's very important. So where the non-cooperation movement and its significance for the peasants is concerned in terms of the involvement, participation of the Indian peasants in the political struggle for freedom, I think non-cooperation movement plays a crucial role, because for the first time at an all India level, there is this involvement. Because who are the people who are participating? When we say it was an all India mass movement, once we go outside the towns, who are the people who are participating? Obviously, they are peasants. So if we don't account for the participation of peasants, how does it become a mass movement? How does it become an all India movement? So it is obvious that there is wide, of course, the data also tells us this very clearly. A large number of people who went to jail and this and that and the other also. It is very clear from that kind of data also that this movement had a very, very broad reach. Now, I want to come, because through that, I want to argue a particular idea. I want to come to the Bardoli struggle. You all heard of the name Bardoli struggle. This was a movement in 1928 in Bardoli. Now, what is Bardoli? Bardoli is not even a district. It's a taluka. You understand a taluka like a subdivision. It's a part of a district, all right? Usually there are 3 or 4 such talukas or even more in a district. So in Surat district in Gujarat, there is a taluka. So a relatively small area. Here, there was a revenue settlement that was in progress. What is the revenue settlement? The British had a system where they used to fix what the peasants would pay to the government for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years at a time. When one settlement was over, a new process of settlement would start where the district officials, that's why they were called collectors, would go around the rural areas. They would survey what is the crop, what are the prices, how much is the production, come to an estimate. This is the likely production for the next 20, 30 years. What are likely to be the price rise? So a lot of guesswork was always involved in this. And then announce this is going to be the rate of taxation for the next 30 years. That's how a settlement was made. It was called a revenue settlement. All over India, this happened. Now here a new settlement was in progress, and what the government official announced was something close to a 25% increase in the tax burden. The peasantry of the area said, this is ridiculous. There is no way we can pay this much. There has been no increase in output. Prices have not risen that much, nor are they likely to rise that much. So this is an unfair imposition on us. So they resisted it. They objected to it, right? And they objected to it through the local leadership, local representatives, members in the assembly also took it up. They tried all the normal methods of pressure, persuasion, writing, taking up the issue in the legislative assembly and all that. But the government was adamant it would not agree to any concession, any inquiry, anything. So then the peasants said, so what shall we do? And here then they asked Sardar Patel to come to their help. Now to go back a little bit in background, Bardoli was an area which had been chosen in 1922 by Gandhiji as the place where he will launch civil disobedience, including non-payment of taxes. But then the Chauri Chaura incident had occurred and he had called off the civil disobedience movement. So at that time, a lot of preparatory work had been done in Bardoli in organizing the people, in educating the people, in preparing the people for a mass non-violent struggle. What is civil disobedience all about, etc., etc. So it was not an area which had no experience, was completely unprepared. So that investment now came to the fore and they said, we want to resist this. We don't want to accept. So what do we do? So Sardar Patel was called and he was asked to take the leadership and guide them and organize a movement for non-payment of taxes. Now, it's a very serious affair because under the law, non-payment of taxes is punished with confiscation of your household goods, confiscation of your cattle, your property can be impounded, and in the last analysis, your land can be acquired and sold in payment of that. So for a peasant to undertake to not pay taxes is a very serious matter because the consequences are very serious. It is not only that he can be sent to jail, he can lose his land. And for a peasant, losing land is not just losing an economic source of livelihood, it is losing his whole patrimony, his whole identity, his whole culture. His family land to him is more precious than his life. So it's a very serious matter. But they came to the conclusion that they will undertake such a struggle. And of course, it would be a peaceful struggle, a non-violent struggle. And what was fantastic about the Bardoli struggle was that there was complete 100% almost participation of the people. In that, there was a total boycott of all those small sections who would not agree with them. For example, the local taxi driver refused to take a British officer who landed by train at the Bardoli railway station. He said, no, I cannot take you to your destination because we are boycotting you, because you are not supporting our movement. There was a social boycott, what you call Nai Dhobi Bandh. Those people who were not cooperating, they were denied the basic services in the village of the barber, of the washerman. In the villages, what the people did was that they had organized a system of early warning, where children would be placed on top of trees to look out for the tax collector and the police who would be coming around to confiscate the goods. And the moment they saw these parties coming, they would raise a din, through all kinds of noise, so that people could lock their houses and run away into the fields, so that the police and the collectors could not enter their houses and take, because the law was you couldn't break into a house. So if the houses were closed, they could not go in and confiscate. They would take away their cattle, because cattle could be confiscated. The people would take their cattle away and hide in the fields. Lot of people also went and they could go into the neighboring Baroda territory to hide. So like this movement carried on. And what was fantastic was, though it was a very small area, but it was a kind of total mass movement where almost 99% of the people were with the movement. The women were very active in this movement. They were in the forefront of this movement. And it is in this movement that they gave the title of Sardar to Vallabhbhai Patel. Sardar means leader. And it was in a public meeting, a mass meeting, that the women said, you are our Sardar. And from that day, he became not Vallabhbhai Patel, but Sardar Patel. That's how he became Sardar. So this was a fantastic movement. That kind of unity that they showed, the kind of strength that they showed, brought the government to its knees. The mighty British government was brought to its knees by a small taluka, not even a district, a part of a district, through complete non-violent civil disobedience could bring the government to its knees. They agreed to an inquiry. An inquiry was conducted. The land revenue was reduced considerably to a level which the peasants were willing to accept. So it was a complete success. Bardoli is very important for the symbolism that it generated. It became in India a symbol for peasant resistance. When Bardoli movement was going on, Bardoli days, you understand Bardoli Day? In support, in solidarity with the Bardoli struggle, Bardoli days were observed, were celebrated all over India. In Andhra, in Kerala, in Tamil Nadu, in Punjab. Jathas went from different parts of the India to Bardoli to support the people over there, to say we are with you. Members of the Bombay Legislative Council, Gujarat, as you know, was part of the Bombay presidency. The members of the Legislative Council resigned their seats in support of Bardoli. So again, and Gandhiji was right, like he was there at the back, guiding, advising, and at one point when things were going very tough, he was even prepared to physically come there and guide the movement. But it was not needed. But it was the Gandhian technique of mass, peaceful civil disobedience was given a kind of laboratory experiment kind of a place, example in Bardoli. And it is after seeing Bardoli, rest of India peasants knew what they had to do. And they understood that if it could be done in one place, it can be done everywhere. So everywhere the name and the word Bardoli became symbolic of the struggle of peasants against British rule. So that's why Bardoli was extremely important. Now, obviously, I cannot go into detail about each and every movement, but these three I wanted to tell you because all of them exhibited a different kind of, these 3 or 4 different kind of aspects. Now, after that, I will just do a very brief survey. We next go to 1930-31 civil disobedience movement. Clearly, the peasant involvement in this movement is very high, beginning with the Dandi March, the breaking of the salt, the inauguration of the salt satyagraha, breaking of the salt law. It was not just salt. That is how it began. That was the signal for countrywide resistance against the British. And all over the country, peasants came out in large numbers to support this movement, including there were no tax movements in different parts. UP, very important. Gujarat, very important. Kheda district was the center of that. Andhra, and also there were movements in Bengal, Bihar, Eastern India against what was called the Chaukidari tax. This also were movements by peasants. What was Chaukidari tax? Chaukidari tax was a tax which peasants had to pay, a village had to pay for the local Chaukidar. He was supposed to guard the village and he had to be paid by the village. But instead of becoming a guard for the village, he became the local eyes and ears of the police, like a police spy. So the villagers began to see him as an oppressor rather than as a protector. So what they resented, that they had to pay for their own, espionage, right? So there was a very powerful, see, again, the issue is not how much money is involved. When we talk of exploitation and oppression, it is not only a question of, this is a burden I can't bear. What I can't bear depends on what psychologically I'm willing to bear. Sometimes even a small amount is very oppressive to me because I think it's very unfair. And sometimes a very big amount I'm willing to pay because I think it's okay, it's helping. Like I get angry paying high taxes, high percentage of taxes when I'm angry with the government, right? And or when I see bad roads, bad facilities, then I say, what the hell, why do we pay such high taxes when we can't even get, proper roads? Why do I have to pay a high toll also in order to pay after paying my high taxes from which these roads are supposed to be built or something else? Otherwise, if I have nice facilities and all that, I'll say it's okay. I'm earning a decent amount. I should pay good taxes. So what you think is legitimate and right to pay is not only a question of the economic burden. It's how you see that. So the Chaukidara tax may not have been a very large amount, but it became an object of great resentment to the peasantry because it was used to oppress them. So very powerful movements developed against the Chaukidara tax during the civil disobedience movement. So I'm giving you the examples again, always to illustrate some point about how people perceive oppression and exploitation and how they join different movements. All right, then we have the Gandhi-Irwin Pact in February-March 1931. And what is fascinating is this period from March till December, which is the period of the settlement and the pact, there are a whole lot of peasant struggles which go on taking place because the Congress has said economic conditions are really bad because of the economic depression, and economic demands of the peasants will have to be addressed even during the period of the pact. So it will not be for political purposes, but for economic relief to the peasants. We are not going to ask them to just pay up and not. So a lot of conflict developed between the zamindars, talukdars, government, and the Congress and the peasants during this period of 1931 from March till December. And there was a lot of struggles, there were a lot of oppression, there were a lot of arrests, and finally the settlement broke down. And then again, a second part of civil disobedience movement started, in which again there's very large scale participation of peasants. But the repression was very brutal this time. The government was determined that they were not going to allow the movement to come up at all. So they came down with a very heavy hand. They arrested thousands of people. They indulged in, Gandhiji said, if earlier you faced lathis, now be prepared to face bullets. He could sense the change in the mood of the government. So it was a very repressive situation which they had to face, and yet people faced up to it very bravely. So a few months more the movement lasted, and peasant participation in this movement was also very strong. Now, then I think the important thing that we come to is, it is not a question only of movement, it's also a question of how the relationship in the Gandhian movement between the struggles of the peasants and the policies. We come to the period of the Congress ministries. Extremely important to see how the Congress ministries, which were formed from 1937 to 39, all of them undertook legislation which was in favor of the peasants. Many of them undertook legislation in which the debt burden was reduced. Money lenders were curbed. Many of them undertook where tenancy and landlord relations were, affected. In Bihar, there were the Bakasht lands, which had been usurped by zamindars from the tenants, and they tried to get those returned. So what I'm trying to say is the relationship is not only that you encourage people to vote, but when you get even partial power, then you are trying to do something to ameliorate the condition of the peasants. Of course, during this period, there were also the socialists and the communists and others who were part of the Congress, who were also organizing struggles of the peasants during this time. So in fact, what is very interesting is period 37 to 39 is the period where I would say the peasant issues are foremost in Indian politics. Both at the level of agitation, very powerful movements are there all over India, as well as part of government policy. And we cannot understand this without understanding the linking it to Gandhi and the peasants. It is he who has forefronted peasants in such a way that when the first time the nationalist forces come into power, it is these issues that are foremost for them. They have to be foremost for them. And also how that freedom which they got, the political freedom which was there, the civil liberties which were there, also gave rise to a lot of peasant protest all over the country. Peasant protest in favor of policies, sometimes peasant protest asking for better policies, putting pressure on the ministries, all kinds of things were there. In Punjab, there was no Congress government, there was a unionist government, for example, and very powerful peasant movement developed over there against the government. But also, even though it was not a Congress government, the unionist government also responded by having to bring in pro-peasant legislation, for example, against on the issue of indebtedness. They did not affect the landlords because Unionist Party was full of landlords, but they had to respond on the issue of indebtedness. So I think it's important that we recognize this impact of the whole Gandhian approach as well. Then, of course, we come to the period of the war, leading up to the Second World War. India is made a party to the war, 1939. Congress ministries resign. A period of struggle begins. There is a period of first of the individual, what is called the individual civil disobedience movement, and then finally culminating in the Quit India movement. Now, neither of these two movements we can understand without going to the issue of the peasants. Individual civil disobedience movement, though in name it was supposed to be individual in the sense that individuals were supposed to offer civil disobedience saying, Naik, Pai, Naik, Bhai. It was supposed to be an anti-war movement, which was to say neither a man nor a Anna will we contribute to the war effort. It was again anti-war movement, right? But it was not supposed to be everybody coming together and offering civil disobedience, but select people. But what used to happen was that in an area, let's say in a village or in a local headquarter, district, town, or wherever it is, might be, or even in the town, in a mohalla, the person who has been designated as the person who will offer satyagraha, the way it used to happen was that person had to announce in advance that I'm going to offer satyagraha. And he would then say in a public place in the middle of a chowk or in the middle of the village, he will go there and he will give this speech. It was a set speech, which was against the war. And because he gave a speech against the war, the police would come and arrest that person and put him into jail. But how it became a mass movement, and especially in rural areas, what people would do was they would say, yes, it's going to happen, so-and-so place, so-and-so will offer this satyagraha. But what they would do very often is that they would hide this person in a crowd. Or sometimes they'll disguise the person who's going to offer the satyagraha. And a large crowd of people will come with that person hidden somewhere so that he could not be arrested quickly. And then in the middle of this huge crowd, this person will then get up and make this speech. And then the police would have to come and try to get in through this huge crowd to reach this person, to arrest that person. And then it will become a big tamasha, demonstration, and you're doing this. I mean, the whole mass involvement in individual civil disobedience happened in this kind of a way that in any case, wherever such any individual was offering, a huge crowd would collect. But in addition, they would do all these kinds of things. Sometimes in Punjab, they would dress up a person as a woman, and then put him in a crowd of women and go there. Now, how is the police going to go through the women to catch that person? So everybody would have a lot of fun at the police expense, at the government expense. The whole idea was, you must understand the symbolism. All this it breaks the fear. If you make fun of the police, you've broken the fear of the police from people's minds, right? Just as Gandhiji broke the fear of jail. Jail used to be called the sasural. Jahan jaake khatir hoti hai. It's something you seek, something you want to go to. Jail is not a burden. I want to go to jail because jail is what is going to bring me glory and my independence. So I want jail. So I take away the fear of jail. Right? Similarly, I take away the fear of the police by these kind of activities, where you make the police look like clowns, because they have to do this and that. And usually local police, in any case, by the time we are in 1941, 42, there is so much respect for the local nationalists, those who are fighting against the British, that the local police usually had a good relationship with them. They would they are supposed to follow some person. They will say, tum jaake khana wana khao, raat raho apne ghar, kal fir se tumhe le chalenge, Even when they were escorting a person, they would be very sympathetic to that person, So this was a way in which, as you say, the world turns upside down. What is a revolution? A revolution is when the world turns upside down. What was authority becomes hated. What was not considered to be respectable becomes respectable, right? What did the French Revolution do? Somebody like the emperor, somebody you held, you believe was God, right? A peasant was supposed to believe emperor was God, Pope was God, church was God, of course, but much more. You overturned everything, no? You turned it upside down. So that is what this non-violent struggle also does through its various ways. It turns the world upside down, where ordinary people in villages can even think of doing these kinds of things, and in the middle of the war, when any act of Leave alone civil disobedience. Civil disobedience, always you're breaking the law, you can be picked up and put into jail. But an ordinary protest, a non-violent protest, a demonstration, everything is outlawed, it's banned. Normal laws were not operating during the Second World War. Normal laws had been suspended, what was called the Defense of India rules, where you were not allowed to even collect 5 people like Section 144 all the time. Okay. Now, in that situation, you get this kind of public defiance. And of course, Quit India did it on a massive scale. What happened in Quit India? Who were the people who fought the Quit India movement? In the urban areas, it was primarily the students who were at the helm of the Quit India movement. Because when the Quit India movement was still to be launched, and the famous speech was given by Gandhiji in Bombay on the 8th of August saying, you know, preparing the people for Quit India, do or die, karenge ya marenge, a movement is coming, a big struggle is coming. He's preparing the people. But the next day, they pick up the entire leadership and put them into jail. Top leadership, provincial level leadership, local level leadership, everybody who's recognizable is picked up and put into jail. So there are no leaders outside. So what happens? The movement bursts out. Quit India movement is never launched officially. Do you know that? It was a movement which erupted on its own. Gandhiji had said, I will write to the Viceroy, give him 15 days to reply. He had not said from tomorrow we are launching the movement. The movement emerged in anger against the action of the government in arresting the entire leadership. He said, how dare you? These are our national leaders. You can treat them with such disrespect. We will show you. And the movement erupted. And as I said, in the towns, it was the students who were at the forefront. Hindu college students, St. Stephen's College students, Delhi University, generally Delhi University students were in the forefront in Delhi, Patna University, Bombay University, everywhere students, and they faced bullets and many died because there was severe repression, big demonstrations, and so many students died in that. And then many ran away from the cities and they went into the rural areas carrying the message. And it is these students who went into the rural areas in eastern UP and Bihar from the Banaras Hindu University, Kashi Vidyalaya, who went, carried this message, and a whole parallel government emerged over there. For 15 days, there was no British authority in the whole of rural East UP and Bihar. 15 days, there was no British police, everybody withdrew, army, police, everybody withdrew from there. So who was behind this? The peasants, no? You could not have this kind of movement without the peasants. So Quit India rebellion was primarily outside the towns, as I said, and in the towns it was suppressed very quickly, to the extent that it lasted as a mass movement for another 3 months. It was all because of the peasants. And different kinds of protests were held everywhere. What was to be called satyagrahas. You know, people would collect at the district headquarters, sit down over there, demand this, show their anger. You know, peaceful protests were held and violent protests were also held. After that, of course, the underground phase of the movement came with Jayaprakash Narayan and Aruna Asaf Ali and Ram Manohar Lohia and all the socialists organized that. That was a different phase of it. Even there, they could not have been successful unless they had the support of the peasants. And in addition, there were 2 areas in which there were parallel governments which lasted for a long time. In Midnapur in Bengal, it lasted from 42 till 45. And in Pune and Satara in Maharashtra, it also lasted not till 45, but for quite some time, quite a few months. There were parallel governments where, you know, as they said, din ke time British ka raj hota tha aur raat ko the parallel governments, you know, there it was their raj, you know, and all kinds of things happened during that. Who was supporting these? The peasants. Obviously, this could not have happened without the peasant support. They were the ones who were involved. So what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about peasants, we are not just talking about different peasant struggles, you know, it's not just a Bardoli or a Kheda or a Champaran. They are also that. But it is in the national movement itself. What is the national movement without the peasants? Nothing. When we say it is a mass movement because peasants are in it. Okay. If it was a purely urban movement, if it had remained a purely urban movement, British would have suppressed it long ago. The strength came from the rural areas. Look at what's happening around you. Let me give you some example. Your ma'am mentioned in the beginning, and I'm very glad she made the connection. Why it's important for us to today also understand the farmers' movement, the Kisan movement going on right now. What is its strength? How can such a movement be suppressed? You can suppress the movement maybe at the Delhi border. You can forcibly remove people from there. You may remove people from Ghazipur border. You may remove people from Tikri border. But where will they go? You remove them from there. Where will they go? They'll go back to villages. Can you dare enter villages and suppress a movement? Does any government have the power to go to thousands of villages where the people know the village? They know each gully, they know each house. It's their area. You send a police force inside. What will they do? Firstly, they will dare not enter. And in any case, how many will they enter? 1, 2, 10? Can they enter thousands of villages? This is what Gandhiji said. Does the greatest despot in the world have the power to blow from the mouth of cannons people of 700,000 villages? Cannot. He said if 10 people from every village in India, only 10 people come forward, this government can't do anything. It cannot. No government can just shoot off so many people. What will they do? They will have to bend. There's a very big difference between a rural protest and an urban protest. Urban protests are of different. I don't have today time to go into all this. The time is already, I think, 12. It's past 12. 12:13 is what I'm seeing. Yeah. So I think I've gone on for more than an hour. I need to stop.
But we are enjoying. You're enjoying. We are enjoying it.
Yeah. Thank you. That's kind of you. But I think it's extremely important to understand this character of peasant protest. This is what gave the depth to the freedom struggle. You know, British officials are very clear about this. It is when the movement started spreading to the rural areas, they said this is a worrisome thing. We can handle it in the urban areas, but when it goes to the rural areas, it's very difficult to handle. How will you suppress it? And that's what Quit India showed, you know. Okay, now just one last word to just bring it up to date. Just you had mentioned also the Zamindari abolition phase, so I just want to connect it. When it became clear that Indian independence is around the corner, and this begins to happen from 1945-46 onwards, when all the leaders are released, Shimla conference is held, elections are held again, 1946, Congress governments are formed, people begin to understand freedom is coming. So what you see in the period 46 to 47 is again an upsurge, Kisan upsurge in India. Why? Because Kisans now come forward and they're asserting themselves, asserting their rights, saying in this coming freedom, we have to get our due. So you get very powerful peasant protest in India during this period till the communal riots start. Till then, it's a period I can give you examples. Tibhaga movement, Telangana, in Punjab, in Bihar, in Bengal, everywhere. And anti-zamindari movements, for example, some of them violent also. Then we come to the period after independence, and there I want to make the connection, as your ma'am had said. It is because of this background of the peasant role in the freedom struggle, the powerful peasant movements, that immediately after independence, the first thing that the different provincial governments in India are told to do, and they do, is to bring in anti-zamindari legislation. Some places it is called anti-jagirdari, like in Andhra Pradesh, word is different. meaning is the same. UP, there's the Anti-Zamindari Act everywhere. In fact, in many parts already, anti-Zamindari, abolition of Zamindari legislation was already ready before independence. You know, the bills and all were already. In fact, in Madras presidency in 1937-38, Zamindari Abolition Inquiry Committee had been appointed, and they had prepared the documents right then, but then the Congress ministries had to resign. So in the period that we see from about 1950, the first few years only, 49, 50, I want to point out Jammu Kashmir had one of the most radical anti-Zamindari legislation. It was the first also, National Conference. Almost immediately after integration, first thing they did was abolish the big zamindars and give land to the peasants. That is one reason the economic conditions in Kashmir of the peasantry improved radically during that period, and also why National Conference was so popular. So various places. However, what happened was that there was a lot of resistance from the zamindars. And what they did was they put large number of cases in the courts, thousands of cases in the courts, and stopped the implementation. And then a constitutional amendment had to be brought by Jawaharlal Nehru, where it was said that this legislation, anti-Zamindari legislation, could not be questioned. Because if you went into fighting each of those cases, the matter would be over. You would never win. So you had to bring it. So this to enable the abolition of Zamindari legislation to be implemented, a constitutional amendment was brought in to make these objections invalid. And that's how finally the whole Zamindari abolition and all that. Also, I want to point out to something else, something which happened without any law or any act being passed. And people forget about this. What was the biggest burden on the peasants as far as government was concerned before independence? Land revenue, right? Land revenue, we all read that. We all know that land revenue was the biggest burden. And we also know that in addition to that, in those irrigated areas, there also used to be what was called a water tax, Abhyana, which was also very heavy. Places like Punjab, for example, UP. Now, what happened in the 50s was, without doing anything, without saying anything, land tax, land revenue disappeared in any meaningful way. Because once the price rise starts to happen, unless the land tax is raised, it becomes inconsequential. Suppose your land tax was 5 rupees, and the prices rise and your income rises accordingly. So what happened was that today you all know, an income tax cannot be applied to the peasant. You know our system. There is no agricultural income tax. So we do not impose any income tax. So the only way the peasantry could be taxed was through the land revenue system, which was different from income tax. Okay. Land revenue was a tax on the land. Right. It didn't matter what income you had from it. It was a different system altogether. So we neither put in an income tax after independence, nor did we allow that system to really operate. We allowed it to die out. So a very big change which happened in terms of the relationship between the state and the peasants was that state exactions were virtually abolished after independence. Unfortunately, this is hardly noted, hardly talked about in the literature on agrarian reform, because it was such a big issue, but it virtually disappeared. And this shows the power of the peasant in the freedom struggle, the power of the peasant movements, that this could happen. This was radical because all governments before this, whether it was the Mughal, whether it was the Khiljis, whether it was the people before that, everybody taxed the land. So this is revolutionary that the state takes nothing from the agrarian sector. Okay? So I'll stop there.
Thank you, ma'am, for sharing your insights and expertise. It was really, really engaging. Moving on to our next segment, which is the question and answer session, I would like to call upon Sakshi, Shamaila, Shreya from third year, and Shubhanshi from second year history honors to go ahead and take questions for the speaker from the participants. Just to remind, please be sure to type your questions in the chat box and the moderator will make sure that they are addressed. Over to you, Sakshi. Sakshi, are you there?
Okay, I'll start asking the first question. Let's not wait. So, Gunevi Jaiswal has written, Gandhiji was perceived as Masiha or demigod among peasants. Was he the same in the minds and hearts of Hindus and Muslim peasants alike? There was a few instances like Mappila revolt where the identities were created of Hindu landlord and Muslim peasants. So did religion made any play in perceiving Gandhiji by peasants, or peasants here means a homogeneous class?
Okay, do we go one by one?
Yes, ma'am, if you want.
All right. I would say that firstly, I think we'll take the Mappila question separately. But I think it's important to recognize that, for example, the first movement mass movement, All India, which Gandhiji launched, the non-cooperation movement, you mustn't forget that it was also along with the Khilafat movement. In fact, Mappila question can be understood also as part of that. So apart from that, I think my own understanding is that Hindu and Muslim peasants both responded to Mahatma Gandhi. I don't think that there was any distinction between the way in which they responded in different areas. We have so many examples of Muslim peasants also responding, and there's not that kind of divide in the rural areas as we try to imagine. And whatever divide came, it came much later in the 40s. It was not there in that period. As far as the Mappila is concerned, I think you need to know a little bit about the agrarian system in Kerala, in Malabar district where the Mappila rebellion took place. You see there, a very large number of the landlords happened to be Hindu by religion. And in this particular area, where the revolt took place, what are called the Mappilas, these were the Muslim Mappila peasants. The peasants, and they were tenants of these landlords, happened to be Muslims. Now, the way the revolt began, they were also inspired by the Khilafat movement. It was initial for a long time, there was nothing religious about it. There was no religious ideology, there was no religious content or flavor to this movement. It was purely an anti-British movement. It was not even initially, focus was not on the landlords. However, as the movement developed, there were attacks on landlords and also on some spies who were working for the British. It's the British who then gave it a Hindu-Muslim twist by projecting that it was the Muslim peasants were attacking the Hindus. They were not attacking Hindus, they were attacking landlords and spies. But yes, they succeeded in giving it this kind of a twist towards the end. In the local this thing, they tried to give this kind of a color to it. However, for us, it's very important to recognize the peasant content of the rebellion. And in fact, by and large, there were not those kind of attacks on Hindus. Large areas of territory in which the Hindu landlords were there, they lived, they were not touched by the peasants who actually had the run of the land. Also, we have to also remember that it was primarily an anti-British rebellion, and we have to remember also that the kind of repression that was launched on the Mappilas in this rebellion was unbelievable. There was that famous incident, which I don't know if you people have read about or not, in which a few hundred of them were put into a bogie, a rail bogie, And then it was a closed one. And it was shunted off and it was left somewhere. And few hundred people died in that bogie. And many of the people who were arrested were kept in jail for 10 years, 15 years. Brutal repression took place of those who were part of the Mapla rebellion. I think we have to remember all that also.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for answering it at the best. Sakshi, continue.
Ma'am, the next question is, does Gandhi not contradict himself by calling off several movements when it turned violent and then himself supporting the decision of sending Indian soldiers to World War?
Firstly, the person asking the question is mixing up the chronology. When Gandhi, the example of Gandhiji calling off a movement because of violence, which is the Chauri Chaura incident, happens in 1922 at the end of the non-cooperation movement. And when you say that he was sending Indian soldiers to the World War, that is 1918. It's 4 years before that. And that is in Gujarat, after the Kheda struggle, which I talked about. Okay, now I think firstly, let's understand why he went through that short phase where he said he will recruit. And he was totally unsuccessful because even those who supported him in the Kheda peasant movement, they didn't come forward for the recruitment. So he understood that there is no sentiment in favor of it. Till 1919, till the Jallianwala Bagh incident occurred, till Rowlatt Satyagraha occurred, Gandhiji's political position was very clear. He said, I'm asking for my rights as a British citizen. I'm not asking for the overthrow of British rule. I want the reform of British rule, right? That was his political position. Even in South Africa, he had taken the position that I'm asking for my rights as a citizen of the British Empire. I want the same rights as the other citizens of the empire, like the whites have over there. So I must also do my duties. And there, as you know, he supported the regime over there, even though he went only on a medical mission, but still he supported them in the war against the Zulus. Now, here also, his understanding was that if I ask for rights, I have to perform duties. So if I'm saying I'm asking for my rights as an Indian citizen, if my country is at war, I also have to show my support by supporting them in that war. This was his position. It didn't have much real value because nobody responded to his call for recruitment. The same peasants who were with him a few months ago, turned their faces away when they went to they went from village to village trying to do this, that he stopped. So firstly, chronologically, it's wrong. That is a separate phase. Secondly, as far as the non-cooperation movement is concerned and the decision to withdraw the movement after the incident in Chauri Chaura, it's a difference. You have to, how do I say it? These are not simple questions to which there are simple answers. Violence is not just one thing. You can't say that because Gandhiji didn't believe in violence, therefore, why did he do this? Why did he do that? Then you can say 1942, the movement was violent. Why did he not come out and condemn it? Chauri Chaura has to be understood in a certain framework. Chauri Chaura has to be understood as an incident. What was the violence in Chauri Chaura? Do you know what it was? What happened in Chauri Chaura?
Police stations were burned.
One person answer.
Yeah, ma'am, the policemen were inside the police station and the police station was burned.
Ma'am answered. I wanted the students to answer.
Actually, ma'am, they'll be studying modern India, that part of modern India in the 6th semester. So some of them don't have that kind of clarity about it.
Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. My point is, the incident was a very serious one. Some 20 plus policemen were killed inside a police station because what happened was that they fired on a crowd. Crowd got very angry. Crowd attacked the policemen. They took refuge in the police station. It was closed and they were set to fire. Now try and think. Any government, if it does not react, if so many policemen are attacked by the protesters and killed in an incident like this, is not going to survive. Gandhiji knew when that incident happened that the British are going to immediately use this incident to come down heavily on the whole movement. They are going to suppress it. They are not going to allow this movement to go forward. There was no way they would allow the civil disobedience in Bardoli to go forward once this incident has happened. Immediately, they would take a very tough stand. So what did he do? He said, this is against the principles of our own movement because we are not for violence. We believe in non-violence. So I voluntarily withdraw my movement. Thereby, he saves the movement from repression. He saves thousands of people who would have got hurt. He probably saved many people who would have been shot because people would have resisted also. A leader of a movement is faced very often with very difficult choices. When you are studying a movement, you might understand that whole situation. You can't just pick up the thing and say, why did he do this? Read about the contemporaries. How did they understand that? Yes, there were people who were angry at that time. They said, why has Gandhiji withdrawn this movement because of one incident that has happened in Chauri Chaura? Jawaharlal Nehru was one such person who initially was very unhappy. But you read his autobiography, and that he writes, he said, initially I was very angry. I was very unhappy with what Gandhiji has done. He said, later I understood that he was right, that our movement was also going to pieces. There were other factors also. Movement was on a decline. It gave, and sometimes leaders take decisions not formally, consciously. It's also very instinctive. Leadership is an instinctive process. When you are immersed in people, you feel what people are feeling instinctively. You become part of that. Like if you've been in a protest, in a crowd, how does a crowd get formed? Right? There are disparate individuals, no? 100 people, 200 people, 300 people become a crowd with one motive. How does it happen? Something happens, no, in that situation where everybody gets involved, thinking the same thing, wanting to do the same thing. A lot of it is just instinctive, no? Those 300 people are not communicating with each other, saying, WhatsApp, saying, okay, let's do this. You may have come to Jantar Mantar because a WhatsApp message came to you, but once you're there, you become part of a totality. Leaders also react to that totality. They understand in their bones, that's why they're leaders. And Gandhiji had this quality above all, which everybody recognized. That's why he was a mass leader par excellence. Everybody bowed to him when it came to a mass movement. He understood the people. He understood how people function. As they say, nabas pehchante the. He understood the pulse of the people. Right? So the decision at Chauri Chaura was a complex one. It was not just a simple question of the violence. So the violence itself was of, it was not just a question of any violence. The violence was of a very crucial kind. It would have brought a tremendous repression from the state.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, the next question is, why Gandhiji is being criticized so much by some people?
That's too general a question. I can't answer. Some people Gandhiji criticized. I mean, you have to ask a specific question. No? I don't know who some people, which, what. Are you talking about the Godsewalas or are you talking about, the radicals? I don't know. How do I answer a question like that? A questioner must always take the trouble to ask a question which has meaning. Okay? That's my answer to that student.
Ma'am, the next question is, what spurred your interest into understanding the way the peasant of India understood Gandhi?
What is the?
What spurred your interest into understanding the way the peasant of India understood Gandhi?
My first research, my doctoral research was on the peasant protest and agrarian economy of Punjab. So I studied the peasantry in great detail, tried to understand what makes them function. What are the economic issues, political issues, social issues. I did a lot of oral history, a lot of interviews with peasant leaders. I went to their villages, sat with them, chatted with them, tried to understand what it was all about. And after doing that, I came to the conclusion that you have to go back to Gandhi. You can't understand the peasants, you can't understand India's freedom struggle, because everywhere I came across how people would explain, everywhere he was there. He was there in every conversation. Why did they adopt the methods they did? Even when they were in Punjab, they were led by socialists and then communists. And yet all the movements were non-violent. So I asked myself the question, how come even communists and socialists who don't believe, who are not against violence, I don't say they believe in violence, but who are not against using violence, why would their movements also be non-violent? I had to answer that question. Why was non-violence relevant in India? And if you ask that question, you go to Gandhi, because he understood why non-violence, it could only be non-violence. So the bigger question, for which I don't have time today, is why non-violent resistance? And there you come to the peasant. Primarily, it is in response to the peasant's way of life. His needs, his strengths, his weaknesses, or her strengths, her weaknesses, that the whole method and strategy of non-violent struggle is evolved. A peasant has tremendous capacity to struggle, but peasant also cannot struggle forever. He has to go back and till his land. He lives on that land. He's not getting a salary from somewhere. If he doesn't cultivate, he cannot cultivate 1 year. His brother will, as we found, I got so many examples. A person would say, 1 साल तो मेरे भाई ने बोला कि हम तुम्हारा परिवार को देख लेंगे, तुम जाओ जेल जाओ, पर कितने दिन तक? How long can my brother look after my family? How long can he cultivate my land? I have to go back and look after my family. So I can go for 1 year, few months, but next year I must go back. Who is going to look after my land? Who is going to take care of my family? So you also need the breaks in the movement. You need forms of struggle where the repression is not so that your movement will be destroyed from word go. You need forms of struggle where the movement can grow, can develop. It's very complex. We've written about it. You should read what we've written. India's struggle for independence. We've explained the whole theory of why Gandhi chooses non-violence. What is the meaning of, what is the strategy of struggle? What is the place of non-violence in it?
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. These were all the questions, and thank you for answering these questions.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering all the questions so patiently. I would now request Anushri, Gatha Secretary, to give the vote of thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. As all good things come to an end, so has this webinar. I, Anushri, wished Secretary of Gatha take this opportunity to thank all those who have directly and indirectly contributed to this webinar on Gandhi and Indian peasants, an intimate relationship. We are grateful to our honorable speaker, Professor Mridula Mukherjee, for gracing this webinar with her kind words and presence. Thank you, ma'am, for adorning this webinar and expanding our knowledge base with your wonderful insights. We're really enlightened with your knowledge, ma'am. Also, I would like to thank our principal, Professor Harpreet Kaur, for her enthusiastic encouragement. Now, I extend my gratitude to our teacher in charge, Dr. Daljit Kaur, for supporting us to organize this webinar. It would be worth mentioning Dr. Simi Kapoor Mehta, who assisted us in all possible ways. We are thankful to our faculty members for their constant support and encouragement. This online webinar could not have been possible without the technical expertise of Mrs. Anita Pathak. At this point of time, I would like to thank my fellow mates, Ananya, President of Gatha, Mansi Malik, Vice President of Gatha, Afia Malik, our digital head, assisted by Shubha Sharma and Pratishtha Sharma, Shubhanshi Mishra, Executive Member of Gatha, Sakshi, Shamaila Afroz, and Shreya Sharma, our third year students of history honors. At last, it would not be justified if I do not thank all the listeners who patiently attended the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anushri. I now request all the participants to fill up the feedback form, and we would